Exodus 40 then. Claudine's going to read that for us.
Exodus chapter 40, and I'll start from verse 18. Exodus 40, verse 18. When Moses set up the tabernacle, he put the bases in place, erected the frames, inserted the crossbars, and set up the posts. Then he spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering over the tent, as the Lord commanded him. He took the tablets of the covenant law and placed them in the ark, attached the poles to the ark, and put the atonement cover over it. Then he brought the ark into the tabernacle and hung the shielding curtain and shielded the ark of the covenant law as the Lord commanded him. Moses placed the table in the tent of meeting on the north side of the tabernacle outside the curtain and set out the bread on it before the Lord as the Lord commanded him. He placed the lampstand in the tent of meeting, opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle, and set up the lamps before the Lord, as the Lord commanded him. Moses placed the gold altar in the tent of meeting in front of the curtain, and burned fragrant incense on it, as the Lord commanded him. Then he put up the curtain in the entrance, at the entrance to the tabernacle. He set up the altar of burnt offering near the entrance to the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and offered on it burnt offerings and grain offerings, as the Lord commanded him. He placed the basin between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it for washing. And Moses and Aaron and his sons used it to wash their hands and feet. They washed whenever they entered the tent of meeting or approached the altar, as the Lord commanded Moses. Then Moses set up the courtyard around the tabernacle and altar and put up the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard. And so Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels.
Well, it is great to see you all here this morning. Whether you're here as a regular or you're visiting or you come occasionally, it's great to have you here. And you've joined us today at the end of a series of talks that we've been doing through the book of Exodus, which is right near the start of the Bible. And we've come at the end to chapter 40, right at the end of this story. But what I thought we'd do is we'll do a little bit of a recap of the story of Exodus, because as you'll see, it's actually remarkably relevant for a day on which there is a baptism. And that will then help us set the context for what we've just had read to us as well. So, firstly, why have we been going through the book of Exodus? It's not just because it's in the Bible, but there's a way in which the story of Exodus is our story. It's a story that relates to us, that we can see in all sorts of different ways. So let's start off the story, and somewhere I have a clicker which will hopefully work. It starts off with the Israelites, God's people in Egypt. Now, maybe you've seen this film, The Prince of Egypt, a DreamWorks animation from my childhood, I think, when it first came out. And the story of this film is loosely based on this story from the Bible, from the book of Exodus. And it starts with God's people, the Israelites, as slaves in Egypt, being subjected to forced labor. They are whipped and punished and beaten and made to work for the Egyptian king, Pharaoh. But God hears their cries and he acts. He comes and tells Pharaoh to let his people go. Famous phrase, "Let my people go," says Moses, God's messenger. And Pharaoh says, "No." And so begins, in the first half of Exodus, what some people have described as a bit of a God contest. On the one side, you have the one true God of Israel, and on the other, you have all of these so-called gods of the people of Egypt. And God, through a series of wonders, miracles, signs, whatever you want to call them, demonstrates how he is better. He is more worthy of praise. He is more powerful than all of the pretend gods of Egypt. Here up on the screen, you've got 10 plagues that he brings. And each of them, we can't tell exactly which matches to which Egyptian god, but each of them is showing, no, this God, he is the true God. These Egyptian gods, they are nothing. Only the true God has power over the River Nile in the first one, which was the source of life for Egypt, and God had power over that. Or the livestock, who some of the Egyptian gods are in the image of this livestock. Or darkness. One of the Egyptian gods is the god of the sun, and yet it is the true God, the God of Israel, who makes the land dark in the middle of the day. But Pharaoh the king keeps on resisting. He keeps on resisting. He wants his free labor. He's got used to it. But then the final plague arrives. And in the final plague, Pharaoh's son, his heir, who again to the Egyptians was a god, this dynasty of kings were divine, this son dies. And Pharaoh finally relents and sets God's people free. They are saved. And here again, a picture from the film. Sorry, it's not so great on the screen, but Moses leading God's people out of Egypt, out of slavery. And as we went through this, we saw at least two things that God was showing us. Firstly, he was showing himself to be the only true God. Maybe you're here today, and like many of us, you would say, yeah, I believe in God, but we don't really tie that thought down. Which God do we believe in? God's maybe just an idea, or a distant presence, or maybe just even a nice fairy tale, a kind of source of stories to tell the kids. But the Bible doesn't let us stay there. The Bible wants us to know that it's not just God is this kind of concept in the sky. No, he is the true, real God who shows himself in this world. He shows himself as powerful, as better than anything else, as worthy of worship, the only God worth believing in. But a powerful God isn't that good to us unless we know that he cares for us. And so secondly, this story in the Bible shows us that God cares about the suffering and the struggles in this world. His people forced into backbreaking labor, and the Bible tells us that God heard their cries and had compassion on them, and he came down to save them. In fact, this is a repeated theme all the way through the Bible. God cares for the poor, the oppressed, the orphan, the downtrodden, the weak, the vulnerable. Maybe you're here and you know something of the struggles of life, the fight to stay financially afloat, or the stress of work, or the stress of unemployment, bereavement, illness, people taking advantage of you. God cares. He hears our cries. He rescues. That is the kind of God he is. And so in the book of Exodus, he rescues his people from slavery. He takes them out, but there is a deeper problem. And there is a deeper problem that this people in the book of Exodus faced and that we all face. And it's seen in what happens next in the story. God saves his people from slavery to the Egyptians, but they are still slaves to something even bigger. So what happens next? Well, first, God gives them instructions on how to live now that they've been set free. God is the only true God, and so they must serve only him. And maybe we're thinking then, well, that doesn't sound much like freedom. Saved from slavery, but now they've got to serve God. That doesn't sound like freedom. But here's the thing. Serving the God who made us is where we are truly free. Now, maybe you've come across this children's book, The Snail and the Whale. There was a film version made on TV a couple of Christmases back. And the story is of a snail that goes onto the back of this great big humpback whale and goes on a trip around the world. But towards the end of the book, the whale gets beached. It's trapped on a beach. And the thing is, we know that that is a bad thing, right? We know that's a bad thing. The whale is made for the ocean. The ocean is where it is free to be a whale. And so all the people in the story work together to get the whale back to where it's meant to be, swimming in the ocean. When it's in the ocean, it is truly free. Now, a friend of mine puts it like this. He says, just as whales are made for the ocean, so we are made for God. Living for him is where we are truly free. Why? Because he made this world and he made us. He knows how it works best. Now, football players may joke about hating the referee, but they all know that without the laws of the game, football just wouldn't be football. It wouldn't be any fun if there was no penalty, if you just suddenly picked up the ball and ran with it. It wouldn't be football. You need the rules. You need the laws of the game for the game to work. And in the same way, God's rules, God's laws aren't restrictions to squash us. They're to enable us to live life as it is meant to be. But rather than live that life of freedom that God had rescued them for, God's people turned their backs on the God who just saved them. What did they do? They built a calf, a cow, out of gold, and pretended that it had saved them from Egypt. After all of that God contest between the gods of Egypt and the true living God, suddenly God's people kind of want back to the gods like they had in Egypt that were in the image of an animal. They build a golden cow. Oops. There we go. A golden cow. That was the best picture I could find. They wanted something they could see. Something impressive that they could show off to the other nations around them that had these statues. A golden statue instead of a God who'd saved them. You see, their problem went deeper than slavery in Egypt. They were slaves to something bigger. Now, we know something about this, right? We like to blame our behaviour on the situation that we're in. So if she hadn't said that, I wouldn't have reacted like I did. Or if my life was better, I wouldn't need to drink so much. But the reality is, even if our lives were perfect, if we got the perfect partner, the perfect job, the perfect house, we would still do things that we regret. You just have to look at the lives of the rich and famous in order to see that. God could fix the problems in our lives just like that. But there would still be a problem. We'd think that we would be free if only this was sorted. But in reality, we are slaves to something bigger than us. We're slaves to something called sin. Now, I don't know what you're thinking of when I use the word sin. Maybe you're scared or turned off, just typical of Christians talking about sin. Or maybe actually you're just thinking, well, sin, that's not that bad, is it? It's eating a little bit of too fattening food. A few years ago, Magnum ice cream had a range of the 7 deadly sins, and you could have like 7 different types of ice cream, and they're making the point, it's a little bit sinful to have that Magnum ice cream, but it's okay really. But this story from the Bible, the book of Exodus, shows us that sin is far more serious. At its heart, sin is turning away from the God who gives us everything and turning towards something else to satisfy us. And this is how the story of God's people then is like our story. They turned from the God who had saved them to worship a statue that they'd made as if it had saved them. But we all turn in all sorts of ways from the God who blesses us and look to other things to save us. So fill in the blank for this sentence. If only I had X, my life would be sorted. Isn't that how we often think? Just a bit more money, I'd be okay. It's not that a bit more money would be bad, but we think it would sort everything, and then when the money comes in, there's something else. There's a famous story of an American millionaire about 100 years or so ago who was asked near the end of his life how much money was enough. And his answer, just $1 more. There's always that need for something else. Or perhaps you're here and you're paying attention to the local elections coming up. I've started seeing the posters up round Hardwick. Candidates promising, this time it's going to be different. This time we'll really stand up for you, or it's our party that's really going to make a difference, and elections come and elections go, and the perfect society is always 5 years away at the next election. Or perhaps you're here and you're the self-reliant type. We do love to rely on ourselves, don't we? We want our own way to solve our own problems. But here's the problem with all of these things. We're like the beached whale. We're unable to enjoy the freedom that God made us to enjoy because that freedom's found in life together with Him, where we don't have to keep looking to the next thing to sort our lives out. Our lives may be tough and full of difficulty, but we've got Him. And the thing is that if sin is turning away from God, and it is, then the result should be God turning away from us. So in fact, in the middle of God's response to this golden calf incident, He tells them specifically He doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. God is going to bring justice. He's going to punish evil. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that this means that we're for it. We don't rely on Him. We don't even give Him the time of day. We don't love Him. We often do the things that He hates. But God doesn't just tell us that He's going to punish the guilty. He also says He's going to forgive. That is, to forget someone's guilt and let them go free. So this is what He tells His people right in the middle of His response to the golden calf. He says, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet He does not leave the guilty unpunished. So which is it, God? Are you going to punish the guilty, or are you going to forgive them? Imagine the magistrate in the courtroom saying, you've done something horrific, but I'm letting you off. You're free to go, but don't worry, the guilt's still going to be punished. It doesn't make sense. How can God forgive and yet still punish the guilty? Well, at the heart of the Christian message is the answer to that problem. Because God sends His Son, Jesus, to live a life of perfect freedom. He is the only one who ever lived who was truly free. Free from sin, free to do what is right. free to love God and enjoy living for God in every aspect of life. But then he willingly gave up his freedom and surrendered to death. He laid down his own life. And as he died, he took on the guilt of God's people on himself. If you trust in Jesus here today, it's as if your old sinful life was there with Jesus as he died. It was your guilt that was being punished. Your old sinful life now gone, dead. And now you are free. And just as Jesus rose from the dead, you have a new life too. You don't have to be a slave to sin anymore. And that is what we celebrate when someone is baptized. I'll explain this again when the kids come back in, but when someone is baptized, they are lowered down into the water. It is a picture of that old life dying together with Christ on the cross. But just as Jesus didn't stay dead, they don't stay under the water, as I am sure Saran is very pleased to know. They are lifted out of the water to new life. Here's how one of the writers of the Bible, Paul, puts it. All of us who are baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death. We were therefore buried with him through baptism into death. That's the lowering down into the water, the sign of being buried, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life. As Saran comes back out of the water, it's as if she is coming back from the dead to live a new life with God. And so that brings us to today's passage, Exodus 40. Because what we've seen so far is what God's people were saved from slavery to sin. But here we get a hint of what we are saved for. And Exodus 40 tells us about Moses, the leader of God's people, setting up this special tent, the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle, in the middle of the camp of God's people. So, verse 18, when Moses set up the tabernacle, he put the bases in place, erected the frames, inserted the crossbars. You've got this whole description of setting up the tent and all of the things that go into the tent. And if you've been with us in the last few weeks, you'll have heard something about what all of the different parts of this tent point towards, what they represent. In fact, our house group on Wednesday this week, we made a model tabernacle. Sadly, I left it at home, so I can't show it to you now, but I've got this picture. And this picture goes through all of the different things that were in this special tent that Moses is described as setting up here, verses 18 all the way through to verse 33. You've got an altar that shows that God saves sinners. You've got it calls it the laver, the wash basin, something or other. God cleanses sinners. The tabernacle, the tent, showing that God lives amongst sinners. The lampstand, representing the light of God to sinners. And so on and so on and so on. And if you want to hear more about that, you can go back and look on YouTube for the previous sermons in this series. But most of all, the purpose of the tabernacle was for God to come and live in the midst of his people. That was what they were saved for, life together with God. They could look over to that tent and say, God lives with us now, and we live with him. God was with them. Everywhere they went on the journey out of slavery into the land he had promised them, he was with them, leading them, guiding them, protecting them. So verse 34, we see, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Again, this was the best picture I could find. I actually had to crop it because at the top was a picture of somebody's hands holding the book open for the photo. But there you go. The glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. The sign of his presence comes down. And Moses couldn't enter the tabernacle because the cloud had settled on it. So back then, you couldn't actually go into the tabernacle. God was there dwelling in your midst, but you couldn't go in. His glory, his presence was so pure, so perfect, that sinful humans couldn't approach him. But now for anyone who trusts in Jesus, our sin has been dealt with. It's dead. It's down under the water. It's not coming back up. That old life has gone. Because we have new life now, life together with God. God living in our midst as he did back then, but in our very hearts. And so he leads us, he guides us, he protects us, he saves us, just like he did for his people then, but in our very selves. He creates a new people, just like he did back then, but it's found here amongst those who trust in Jesus. Verse 36, in all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from among the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels. God was with his people. Wherever they went, he was there. And the same is true for those who trust in Jesus today. God is with his people in our very hearts, wherever we go, living with us, guiding us, protecting us, saving us. So if you wouldn't say that you trust in Jesus today, firstly, we are so glad that you are here. Do pick up a welcome bag from the back. There's just outside that back door, there's a load of paper bags that have got some information about who we are as a church and a little book that explains a little bit more about what we believe. So do pick up one of those. But secondly, we hope that if you're here, whoever you are, you've seen something of the great privilege it is to belong to Jesus. This book of Exodus is about God saving a people from slavery and bringing them into his presence to live life together with him. And that is exactly what Jesus promises to each of us. As we baptize Saran in a few minutes, we're acting out something incredible that has already happened to her and to everyone here who trusts in Jesus, dying to that old life of slavery to sin. There was a line in a song we sang earlier, sin's curse has lost its grip on me. That is true if you trust in Jesus. We have a new life, freed from the grip of sin. The life that we were made for, a life that is on offer to everyone here.